Chapter 1, 116 of One Piece. July 1999. The Straw Hats are on Little Garden. They've just met two giants who have been fighting for 100 years over an argument neither of them fully remembers. And in the middle of this arc, in the middle of what most readers filed away as a quirky detour island, Dory and Brogy start talking about where they come from, about Elbaf, about the culture they left behind, about their gods and their warriors and their legends. And in that conversation, buried in what seemed like pure world-building flavor, Oda mentioned the god of war. Just like that, the god of war. A legendary figure in Elbaf's warrior tradition. The giants talk about this title with a specific reverence that they don't use for anything else. And in 1999, every reader on the planet processed that as Norse mythology set dressing and moved on. 27 years later, in 2026, we watched Loki transform. Pause beat. And everything Dory and Brogy said in chapter 116 made perfect sense. Because the god of war isn't a mythological abstraction in Elbaf, it's a title. A specific title. Passed down through the royal bloodline of the giants, granted by the consumption of a specific devil fruit, the Ryu Ryu no Mi model Nidhoggr, the mythical Zoan that turns its user into a dragon so massive it blots out the sky over an entire country, and Loki, the accursed prince, the shame of Elbaf, the impulsive tragic figure who's been locked under the Adam Tree for years, is the current holder of that title. Is the current god of war. Was always going to be. Oda told us in 1999. We just didn't know we were being told. Pause beat. And that is what today's video is about. Because the god of war line from Little Garden is not the only seed. It's just the oldest one. It's the one that proves beyond any reasonable argument that this was planned from the beginning. That Loki's power, his title, his role in the endgame, the Nidhoggr transformation, the prophecy, the Adam Tree connection, the Ratatoskr guardian, all of it traces back to decisions Oda made before most of the current One Piece audience was old enough to read manga. And today, we are pulling every single piece of that 27 years of planting apart and showing you how it was constructed. This is Anime Autopsy. And today we're doing the autopsy on the God of War. Pause beat. Okay. So the Elbaf arc is deep into its run right now. And I know everyone is talking about Loki's transformation. Everyone is talking about the Nidhoggr. And honestly, that is completely fair because what we got is one of the most visually staggering moments in One Piece history. A dragon so enormous that the concept of scale kind of breaks down when you try to process it. A mythological beast whose name literally means the one who gnaws at the roots of reality. And it belongs to the character who's been set up as the most complicated and misunderstood figure in Elbaf. The one everyone called cursed, the one who's been in a cage this whole arc while the real story of what he has slowly revealed itself. But here's the thing that has been eating at me for weeks, right? All of the discussion about Loki's reveal is focused on the what of it. What the Nidhoggr looks like, what it can do, what it means for the final arc. And all of that is valid and good, and we're absolutely going into all of it today. But the discussion almost nobody is having is the how. How did Oda build this? When did he plant these seeds? How far back does the planning for the God of War actually go? Because the answer is further back than you think. Much further. And when you see the full timeline laid out, when you see the specific chapter numbers and the specific years and the specific details that were quietly being positioned for decades before Loki walked into a panel, the construction of this character becomes one of the most impressive things Oda has ever done. And that is saying something. That is a high bar. And Loki clears it. So buckle in. Get whatever you usually get before a long video. Because we have a lot of ground to cover, and every single piece of it is genuinely fascinating. Pause beat. Let me start with what we actually know now. what Chapter 1142 and the chapters following it have confirmed about Loki's devil fruit, because I want to establish the factual baseline before we start tracing the foreshadowing backward. I want you to have the complete picture of what was revealed so that when I start showing you where each piece was planted, you can feel the full weight of how long ago it was placed. The fruit's official classification: Ryu Ryu no Mi, model Nidhoggr, Mythical Zoan type. And Mythical Zoan is the rarest devil fruit classification in the series, right? We've seen a handful of them across the whole run. Marco's Phoenix, Kaido's Uo Uo no Mi, model Seiryu, Luffy's Hito Hito no Mi, model Nika. Each of them is associated with a figure so legendary, so deeply embedded in mythology, that the fruit's power borders on the supernatural even compared to other powerful fruits. The Nidhoggr is in that category. It's not just a dragon transformation, it's the dragon transformation, the one rooted in the oldest surviving Norse mythology as the destroyer of worlds. In Norse cosmology, Nidhoggr is the dragon or serpent that lives at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree. And what it does there is gnaw at the roots. Constantly. Relentlessly. Chewing through the foundation of the structure that holds all 9 realms together. While Yggdrasil supports the entire cosmos, Nidhoggr works to unmake it from below. It's not a fire-breathing fantasy dragon in a cave somewhere. It's a cosmic force of destruction. An entity whose existence is defined by the slow, patient dismantling of the very architecture of reality. And that's what Loki transforms into. Slow down. Let that sit for a second. The heir to Elbaf's throne. The prince who consumed a devil fruit that makes him into the mythological embodiment of world-ending destruction. The person One Piece's most powerful martial culture elevated with the title God of War. He is walking around Elbaf as a human most of the time, and underneath that, he is the Nidhoggr. And Oda planted this in 1999. Pause beat. The other confirmed details from the Elbaf arc. The fruit existed in Elbaf for centuries before Loki ate it. It was being guarded, actively protected. A specific guardian called Ratatoskr watched over it. And the reason it needed a guardian, the reason you don't just leave a mythical Zoan fruit of this tier sitting around unprotected, is that the previous generations of Elbaf's royal line understood exactly what this fruit was. They understood the Nidhoggr. They understood what consuming it would mean. And they chose, for centuries, not to consume it, to guard it, to keep it as a potential weapon of last resort. And then Loki ate it, 14 years before the current timeline, during the Orust Castle massacre, under circumstances that are still being fully unraveled, and in doing so became the God of War, the living incarnation of the Nidhoggr, the dragon that gnaws at the roots of the world tree. And the prophecy that exists in Elbaf says that the skies will be covered by a giant beast, and alongside that beast will be the sun god of liberation. Together, fighting the same enemy, Loki and Luffy, the Nidhoggr and Gear 5. Destruction and liberation. 2 supreme forces moving in the same direction for the first time since the Void Century. That's the picture. Chapter 1142 and the subsequent Elbaf chapters gave us. And now I want to show you where every piece of it was hiding. Pause beat. Before we get into the evidence proper, let me establish the standard we're holding ourselves to. Because these kinds of analysis videos can get sloppy fast, right? People start counting vague thematic echoes as foreshadowing, and it stops being useful. So here's the line I'm drawing for what counts as genuine foreshadowing in this video. Visual confirmation. Oda drew a specific design element or imagery that matches what we now see in the Elbaf arc. Not a loose resemblance. The same specific thing. Textual confirmation. Characters or narration in earlier chapters said things that, reading back with the context we now have, were literally describing Loki or the Nidhoggr. Canon text that was pointing at this reveal before it arrived. Structural confirmation. Narrative patterns that are too deliberate, too specific, and too precisely spaced to be retroactive. Setup and payoff architecture that only makes sense as long-term planning. If it doesn't meet one of those 3 criteria, it doesn't make the list. Okay, Let's go. Pause. Beat. Chapter 116, July 1999, Little Garden Arc. And I want to spend real time here because this is the chapter that, in my opinion, proves the entire case on its own. Everything else we cover today is supporting evidence for a conclusion that Chapter 116 already establishes. Let me set the scene properly first. The Straw Hats have been blown off course and ended up at Little Garden, a prehistoric island frozen in a kind of eternal past. And they meet Dorry and Brogy, two giant warriors from Elbaf who have been stranded here for 100 years, dueling over a dispute neither of them can fully articulate anymore. And the thing about Dorry and Brogy that becomes immediately clear is that they are not just fighters, they are representatives. Every time they speak about Elbaf, every time they explain their customs or their values or their traditions, they are giving the reader a window into the culture that produced them. And Oda, being Oda, use that window. Because Dorry and Brogy don't just fight, they talk. They explain Elbaf to the Straw Hats. They describe the warrior's feast. They describe what it means to die in battle as opposed to dying of illness or old age in the giants' value system. They describe the hierarchy of Elbaf's heroic tradition. And in that description, they mention the god of war. Pause beat. Now here's what I need you to understand about why this detail matters as much as it does. Oda is incredibly deliberate about the details he chooses to include when he's doing world building through dialogue. When a character explains their culture, every element of that explanation is there because Oda decided it needed to be there. Dorry and Brogy could have described Elbaf's warrior culture with a dozen different details. The specific weapons used, the specific rituals, the specific geography, the specific political structure, and they touched on several of those things, but the god of war specifically got mentioned, by name, with a clear weight of reverence attached to it. That's not texture, that's not flavor. In One Piece, when something gets mentioned with that specific weight in that specific context, it's a seed. And in 2026, we found out exactly what was planted. The god of war is not a generic title. It's not like how ancient Romans might refer to Mars as the god of war as a cultural shorthand for the concept of martial excellence. In Elbaf, the god of war is a specific position, a specific role, hereditary through the royal line. And the thing that grants the title, the thing that makes someone the actual god of war rather than just an exceptionally skilled fighter, is the Nidhoggr, the fruit, the dragon, the world ender gnawing at the roots of Yggdrasil. Loki is the god of war because Loki ate the Nidhoggr fruit, and Dorry and Brogy mentioned the god of war in 1999 in chapter 116. They told us about Loki's title 27 years before Loki walked into the story. Slow down. Let this land. I want to be honest about something here, right? Because when you write it out like that, it sounds almost too clean. Like I'm retrofitting a connection that wasn't really there. And I understand that skepticism. But here's the thing. The counter-argument requires you to believe that Oda mentioned a very specific and very weighted title in Elbaf's warrior culture in chapter 116, and that this title turned out to be the exact title held by the character who becomes the most important Elbaf figure in the endgame, and that this was all coincidence or retroactive connection rather than planning. And I just don't think that's a credible read of how Oda works. Oda doesn't do throwaway world building. He has demonstrated that across 27 years of consistent payoffs. The God of War line wasn't decoration, it was a promise. And there's more. Because Dorry and Brogy don't just mention the God of War abstractly. The context around the mention includes information about weapons, about the tradition of hammer-wielding giant warriors, about the heroic aesthetic of Elbaf's greatest fighters. And when you look at Loki in the Elbaf arc at Ragnir, at the specific visual design of the God of War's equipment, you see that aesthetic being honored in very precise ways. The hammer-wielding god who transforms into a dragon. That was in Little Garden's cultural description. We just didn't have the full picture yet. Pause beat. Let me talk about why nobody caught this for 27 years. Because that's also an interesting question, right? If the connection is this clear in retrospect, why didn't the One Piece fandom map it decades ago? And the honest answer is partly distance and partly framing. In 1999, Elbaf felt impossibly remote. It was a place two stranded giants were never going to see again. A culture being described by people exiled from it for a century. And when something exists at that narrative distance, when it's described by characters who've been cut off from it for generations, it reads as flavor. It reads as context for the characters in front of you, rather than as setup for something the story will eventually deliver. Elbaf was so far away in 1999 that the specific cultural details felt like texture rather than blueprints. And then, there's the generic Norse mythology problem. When Dorri and Brogi describe the god of war in a culture that is clearly drawing from Norse mythology for its aesthetic, the natural assumption is that this is a generic Odin or Thor reference, a cultural pantheon marker, not a literal position held by a literal person in the story you're reading. That assumption, completely reasonable in 1999, made the detail invisible as foreshadowing. We processed it as flavor. It was actually a fact. Oda was counting on that. He does this in One Piece over and over again. He plants real information inside what looks like decorative detail, specifically because the decorative framing makes it invisible as setup. And then 27 years later, the invisible becomes undeniable. Pause beat. Now let's jump forward. Because Little Garden is the oldest seed, but it's not the only one. And the next one is from a completely different part of the series in a completely different genre of content, which is exactly why most people missed it. Punk Hazard, 2012. Chapters 655 through 699. The Straw Hats arrive at a frozen on one side, burning on the other, completely wrecked abandoned research facility. Former Vegapunk territory. And on this island, among Vegapunk's many bizarre experiments and creations, there are artificial dragons. Pause beat. Now I know what you're thinking. We talked about the dragons at Punk Hazard, and then we got Kaido and his Eastern Dragon fruit, and we filed it away as setup for Kaido. And that was true as far as it went. Punk Hazard absolutely was part of the setup for the Wano arc and for our understanding of Kaido's power. The smile fruits, the artificial lineage factor replication, the dragon experiments feeding into the understanding of what made Kaido's fruit possible, all of that connected. But here's the detail that I don't think got enough attention. The dragons at Punk Hazard are Western-style dragons, winged, four-legged, distinctly European rather than the serpentine Eastern dragon design we associate with Kaido. And that distinction is not accidental. In One Piece, Oda is incredibly precise about the iconographic differences between Eastern and Western dragon aesthetics. Kaido's fruit is explicitly an Eastern dragon, the azure dragon tradition. The long serpentine body, the mane, the flowing movement. That's Wano. That's the Beasts Pirates aesthetic. That's Kaido. The Punk Hazard dragons are different. And the Nidhoggr is different. Slow down. Look at Loki's transformation in the Elbaf arc. The Nidhoggr is not an Eastern dragon. It's a massive, distinctly Western dragon. Winged, powerful, more in line with the European mythological tradition that the word Nidhoggr is literally drawn from. And the Punk Hazard dragons match that design language in ways that the Kaido connection alone doesn't explain. So here's the theory I want to put forward. Vegapunk's Western dragon experiments at Punk Hazard weren't entirely explained by Kaido. They were also, at least in part, an attempt to understand, replicate, or create a counter to the Nidhoggr. Because the world government knew the Nidhoggr fruit existed, the world government knew it was being guarded in Elbaf, and the world government knew that the god of war was the specific thing standing between them and complete dominance over the giants. Imu has been alive for 800 years. Imu knows about every major power in the world. Imu knows about the fruit that can cover the skies of a country with a single dragon transformation. Of course, the world government had a research program aimed at understanding that power. And Chapter 1. 1179 and the following Elbaf chapters confirm this framing. Emu's forces move on Elbaf with a specific knowledge of the Nidhoggr's capabilities. This isn't their first contact with this information. They've been tracking it, preparing for it. The dragon experiments at Punk Hazard were labelled as Kaido adjacent by the narrative, but the Western dragon design was pointing at something else simultaneously. Pause beat. Now let me add another layer to the Punk Hazard connection, because I think there's something here about Momonosuke that becomes very interesting in hindsight. Momonosuke's artificial devil fruit, created by Vegapunk, creates an Eastern dragon, Azure Dragon, based on Kaido's bloodline genetics, and Momonosuke was never supposed to eat it. He ate it by accident as a child because he was starving, and the fruit was described as a failure, an imperfect artificial creation that Vegapunk considered incomplete and dangerous. And yet it worked. Momonosuke became a dragon, an Eastern dragon, a small, young, inexperienced one at first, and then over time, through the series, a genuine power. The massive white dragon we see in the later stages of Wano and after. Here's the thing about Momonosuke's fruit that becomes interesting in the context of the Nidhoggr. Oda created 2 Dragon Devil fruit lines in this series, Eastern and Western, and they're not thematically equivalent. Momonosuke's Eastern dragon is about legacy and burden and living up to an impossible inheritance. He never wanted to be a dragon. He ate the fruit by accident. He spent years being scared of his own power, and then he grew into it. That's the Eastern dragon narrative, the reluctant inheritor who becomes what he was always meant to be. Loki's Western dragon, the Nidhoggr, is about something different. It's about a prince who actively chose to consume a world-ending power at the worst possible moment during a massacre for reasons that are still being fully unraveled. It's not reluctant inheritance. It's a desperate, calculated, or emotionally driven choice to become something terrifying. The Nidhoggr narrative is about what happens when someone reaches for destruction, not out of ambition, but out of crisis, and what that destruction then becomes when it's pointed in the right direction. Oda set up both dragon types in one piece deliberately, Eastern and Western, inherited and chosen, legacy and crisis, and Punk Hazard was where both threads were being woven together in the laboratory context before they separated into their respective arcs. Pause beat. Let me also talk about Imu specifically in the context of Punk Hazard, because Imu's knowledge of the Nidhoggr fruit is not incidental. And I want to establish this clearly before we get to the prophecy section. Imu has been alive for 800 years. In those 800 years, every major power in the world that represented a genuine threat to the world government's control has been either eliminated, contained, or managed. The Lunarians were nearly exterminated. The ancient kingdom was erased. The poneglyphs were scattered. The major warlord system was built specifically to co-opt dangerous individual power into state service. Nothing that could threaten the world government's dominance was allowed to develop freely without some counter-response from Imu's side. And then there's the giants of Elbaf, who have never been defeated by the world government, who have never been subjugated, who remain uniquely a free people with their own culture and their own political structure and their own martial tradition that the world government has not been able to break. Why? The obvious answer is that the giants are just physically too powerful. The world government can't throw enough conventional force at Elbaf to overcome sheer scale advantage, and that's true. But I think the Nidhoggr adds another layer. Because if Elbaf has the god of war, if Elbaf has a prince who can become the Nidhoggr and cover the skies with a world-ending dragon, then the calculation for the world government isn't just about the giant's physical prowess. It's about what happens if the god of war actually transforms and points that power at your fleet. The fruit in Ratatoskr's keeping wasn't just a symbol, it was a deterrent. The Nidhoggr is what kept the world government from ever fully committing to a military engagement with Elbaf. And Vegapunk was trying to develop something that could match it. That's what the Western Dragon experiments were. That's why they're in the same facility where the Smile fruits were being developed. Both programs were about understanding and potentially countering specific extreme individual powers. Kaido for the Smile context, the Nidhoggr for the Western Dragon context. Punk Hazard was the world government's research hedge against the two most dangerous dragon-type transformations in the world, and Oda planted this in 2012, 4 years before we ever heard Loki's name. Pause. Beat. Now. Whole Cake Island, 2017. Chapter 8, 158. And this is the one that I think is the most fascinating piece of foreshadowing in the entire Loki analysis, because it's the most disguised. It's the one where Oda gave you, essentially, Loki's complete character profile and made it look like background information about Big Mom's failed marriage schemes. Chapter 8, 158. Big Mom's territory. Sanji rescue operation in full swing. And in the middle of all of this, we get a piece of information about why Big Mom has a grievance against Elbaf specifically. Why she hates the giants, and the reason is Loki. Loki, the prince of Elbaf, fell in love with Lola, Big Mom's daughter, and proposed marriage. And a marriage between Elbaf's crown prince and one of Big Mom's children would have been the alliance of the century, right? Elbaf's military power, combined with Big Mom's economic and political dominance, the combination would have been essentially unstoppable. It would have changed the balance of power in the new world completely. Lola said no. Pause. Beat. She ran away. She refused the political marriage. She chose her own adventure over dynastic obligation. And that refusal created a rupture between Big Mom and the giants that has poisoned the relationship for years. And in chapter 858, Oda gave us all of this as context for Big Mom's psychology, as explanation for why she's so obsessed with getting the giants under her control. But look at what he actually told us about Loki in that passage. He's Elbaf's prince. First fact, he's impulsive enough to propose marriage to someone he presumably barely knew, which tells us something significant about his emotional directness. Second fact, his marriage proposal, if accepted, would have made him one of the most politically significant people in the New World, which tells us his actual importance and weight in the geopolitical landscape. Third fact. And he's established as a specific named individual with a specific emotional life and specific political consequences to his actions. He's not a background character. He's a named player with stakes. Now think about what Oda was doing here in 2017. He was introducing Loki 9 years before Loki appeared in the manga. Not as a rumor or a vague reference, as a character with enough definition that you can start understanding who he is. Impulsive, romantically direct, heir to enormous power. His personal decisions have kingdom-level consequences. He's being set up at this point in the story as a major figure who will matter when Elbaf comes around. And here's the thing I find most interesting about the whole Cake Island Loki introduction. It establishes him as someone who acts on feeling rather than calculation. Right? The proposal to Lola wasn't a political move. It was emotional. It was impulsive. It was genuine, apparently, in the sense that Loki really did want that marriage. And that characterization matters enormously for understanding the Orist Castle massacre and why Loki ate the Nidhoggr fruit. Because a person who acts on emotion in extremis is capable of reaching for the most extreme available option. Loki ate a world-ending devil fruit during a massacre. That's not a calculated strategic decision. That's a desperate, emotional one. And chapter 858 told us in 2017 that Loki makes decisions with his heart rather than his head. That's not a throwaway detail. That's character architecture. Pause. Beat. And then there's the accursed prince epithet, because when Loki finally started being discussed more seriously in the community, as the Elbaf arc began approaching, the framing around him was almost entirely defined by this reputation. The shame of Elbaf. The accursed prince, the one who killed his own father, the disgraced crown prince who's been locked under the Adam tree in chains for 6 years while his kingdom tries to move past the scandal of his existence. And I want to spend real time on this because I think the accursed prince epithet is one of the most sophisticated pieces of foreshadowing in Loki's construction. because Oda has a very specific pattern in this series with characters who carry terrible reputations. And if you know the pattern, the Accursed Prince title was telling you something very specific about where Loki's story was going. Think about Nico Robin. From her very first appearance, before she was a Straw Hat, before we understood anything about her, Robin carried the reputation of a demon. The Devil Child. The woman who could only bring destruction wherever she went. Every organization she'd ever attached herself to had collapsed. Everyone associated with her ended up in danger or dead. She was considered cursed, genuinely cursed. Not just someone with a bad reputation, but someone whose very existence seemed to invite catastrophe. And she was innocent. She was a child who lost everything because the world government decided her knowledge was too dangerous to allow to exist. She spent 20 years running from an erasure she never asked for. The curse was something done to her, not something she was. And every terrible thing attributed to her came from circumstances she didn't choose. Pause beat. Think about Portgas D. Ace, condemned by lineage before he was born. The son of the Pirate King. The person whose existence the world government considered an offense severe enough to warrant an execution specifically designed to lure his father figure out of hiding. Ace didn't choose his blood. He didn't choose to be Roger's son. He spent his entire life trying to prove that he was his own person, and that his birth didn't define his worth. And the world kept insisting that it did. The world insisted that he was cursed, that his existence was inherently dangerous, that the blood in his veins made him an enemy of civilization. And he was heroic, one of the most genuinely warm, loyal, loving characters in the series. Slow down. These are Oda's cursed characters: Robin, Ace, and now Loki. In each case, the reputation is constructed by people with power who have a specific interest in the cursed person being seen as monstrous. Robin was cursed by the world government because she knew the truth about the Void Century. Ace was cursed by the world government because he was Roger's son. And Loki is cursed by the political situation in Elbaf because the truth of what happened at Horus Castle is more complicated than the official story. And the official story has more politically convenient beneficiaries than the truth does. The Accursed Prince epithet wasn't foreshadowing Loki's villainy. It was foreshadowing his redemption. Oda uses that specific pattern so consistently that once you recognize it, the Accursed Prince title reads as almost a promise that this character is going to be revealed as the victim of a narrative he didn't write. That's the receipts for where Loki's arc was always going, long before the Elbaf arc confirmed it. Jesus. Let me now go to something that I think is genuinely the most impressive piece of structural foreshadowing in Loki's design. Not a line of dialogue, not a visual detail, but a mythological architecture that Oda built across the entire series and then snapped into place in the Elbaf arc with an audible click. The Adam Tree. You know the Adam Tree, it's been in One Piece since the early arcs. The Thousand Sunny is built from Adam Tree wood. Roger's ship, the Oro Jackson, was also partially Adam Tree. It's described as the most legendary wood in the world, the most durable. The tree that, in terms of sheer physical quality, has no comparison anywhere in the world of One Piece. And in the Elbaf arc, Loki is imprisoned under it, chained to its roots. Pause beat. Okay, now let me tell you about Yggdrasil. In Norse mythology, Yggdrasil is the world tree, the cosmic structure that connects and contains all 9 realms. Everything in Norse cosmology is organized around it. The gods live above it. The dead live below it. Various creatures inhabit different parts of it. It is the axis of the universe, the trunk around which everything else is arranged, and at its roots lives Nidhoggr, gnawing, always gnawing, chewing through the foundation of the structure that holds everything together. While Yggdrasil supports the cosmos, Nidhoggr works to unmake it. Now, One Piece's Adam Tree, the most legendary tree in the world, the one with connections to the greatest ships and the most heroic voyages in the series. The one that, in the Elbaf arc, we discover is the physical anchor of one of the most important locations in the endgame. And at its roots, chained there, imprisoned there, is the person who carries the Nidhoggr fruit, who becomes the Nidhoggr, who is, in One Piece's mythology, the equivalent of the dragon at the base of the world tree. Slow down, let this land. Oda recreated the Yggdrasil mythology using the Adam tree. The world tree of One Piece has been in the series for most of its run, and the Nidhoggr has been imprisoned at its roots for 6 years before the Elbaf arc even begins. When Oda decided that Loki would be chained under the Adam tree, he was making a very precise mythological statement. He was saying specifically that the relationship between the Nidhoggr and the world tree that exists in Norse mythology exists in One Piece too. Except in One Piece, the Nidhoggr is a person, and the world tree is the Adam tree, and the chains are the world government's doing, and the story is about what happens when the dragon at the roots is freed. And here's the thing that I find genuinely incredible about this. The Adam tree was introduced decades before Loki appeared. The wood of the greatest ships. The legendary material used by the greatest sailors in One Piece history. Oda was building the Yggdrasil parallel years before he had the Nidhoggr fruit in the story. Or he had the Nidhoggr fruit planned and built the Adam tree as the world tree parallel, knowing that eventually the Nidhoggr would be imprisoned at its roots. Either way, the architecture was laid before the inhabitant arrived. That's not retroactive connection, that's planning. Pause beat. Now let me talk about Ratatoskr, because I think this character gets undersold in most of the Loki analysis, and I want to give the full picture here. Because Ratatoskr is not just a cute name Oda picked from a Norse mythology dictionary to give the guardian of the Nidhoggr fruit. Ratatoskr has a specific function in Norse mythology that mirrors exactly what Ratatoskr does in One Piece, and understanding the mythological function tells you something about how long Oda has been thinking about this. In Norse mythology, Ratatoskr is a squirrel. It runs up and down Yggdrasil, and what it does is carry messages. Specifically, it carries messages between the eagle who lives at the top of Yggdrasil and Nidhoggr who lives at the roots. The eagle and the dragon are enemies. They represent opposing cosmic principles. And Ratatoskr, the squirrel who runs between them, is a messenger. But the messages it carries are described in the source text as deliberately inflammatory. Ratatoskr stirs conflict. It carries words between the eagle and the dragon in a way that keeps their enmity alive. It's a trickster messenger, an instigator, a small creature with enormous influence over the relationship between two much more powerful entities. In One Piece, Ratatoskr guards the Nidhoggr fruit, the guardian of the World Tree Dragon's power. And in the Elbaf context, the relationship between the eagle representing the high powers, the world government, the celestial dragons, the figures of authority who claim to sit above everything, and the Nidhoggr at the roots is exactly the relationship Ratatoskr mediates in Norse myth. The opposition between top-down authoritarian control and the world-ending force that gnaws at its foundation. Pause beat. And here's the thing that really got me when I mapped this out. Ratatoskr's role as the guardian of the Nidhoggr fruit in One Piece means that for centuries, a trickster messenger figure was keeping the world's most destructive power contained at the base of the world tree. Not because the Nidhoggr is inherently evil, not because the destruction should never be unleashed, but because the timing has to be right. Because the dragon at the roots of the world tree is supposed to be freed at Ragnarok, at the appointed time, when the world needs to be remade rather than just preserved. And the prophecy says that time is now. The giant beast covering the skies alongside the sun god of liberation. The Nidhoggr alongside Luffy's Gear 5. Ratatoskr guarded the fruit for centuries because the release wasn't supposed to happen until the right ally was in place, until the sun god returned. Until the conditions for using the Nidhoggr's destruction in service of liberation, rather than simply in service of destruction, were established. Oda built this with Norse mythology, so precisely that the mythological framework predicts the plot. Pause beat. Now let me bring this all together into the complete picture, because I've been going piece by piece through the foreshadowing, and I want to show you what it looks like when you assemble it into a coherent timeline. 1999, Little Garden. Chapter 1, 116. Dori and Brogi describe Elbaf's warrior culture. The god of war is mentioned, the hammer-wielding dragon-transforming title holder. Oda plants the seed of Loki's title and power 27 years before the reveal. 2012. Punk Hazard. Chapters 655 through 699. Vegapunk's artificial dragon experiments. Western-style dragons, matching the Nidhoggr's design language rather than Kaido's Eastern aesthetic. The world government's research program aimed at understanding and countering this specific type of power. Oda plants the institutional context for why the world government has been preparing for the Nidhoggr for decades. 2017. Whole Cake Island. Chapter 8. 158. Loki is named, established as Elbaf's prince. His impulsive, emotionally driven character is sketched in the failed proposal to Lola. His political weight is established through the magnitude of the alliance that could have been. Oda introduces the character with a complete personality profile disguised as Big Mom backstory, and then throughout the later arcs, additional seeds. The accursed prince reputation being established through Elbaf references. The Adam Tree's legendary status being reinforced in the weapons and ships it produces. The growing understanding in the fandom that Elbaf was going to be a major endgame location. All of it converging. 2025 through 2026. The Elbaf arc. Everything pays off simultaneously. Pause beat. That timeline is 27 years, and every entry in it is specific. Every entry has a chapter number. Every entry was describing something real about Loki, or the Nidhoggr, just without the context that would have made it recognizable as Loki foreshadowing at the time. The God of War title. The Western Dragon design. The impulsive Prince of Elbaf. The Adam Tree as Yggdrasil. The Ratatoskr Guardian. The accursed Prince pattern that maps onto Robin and Ace. This is what genuine long-term planning looks like. Not vague thematic echoes. Specific details placed at specific times with a specific connection to a character who wouldn't appear for decades. And now that the character has appeared and the fruit has been revealed and the transformation has happened, you can trace every piece back to where it was placed. Pause beat. I want to talk now about the prophecy, because the prophecy is the piece of foreshadowing that I think carries the most emotional weight of everything we've covered today. And I want to give it the full treatment it deserves. The prophecy from Elbaf's tradition says that on a particular day, the skies will be covered by a giant beast, and alongside it will stand the sun god of liberation. And this isn't a recently composed prophecy. Elbaf has old lore. The cultural tradition of the giants runs deep, and this specific prediction has been part of their cultural memory for long enough that it gets treated not as a fairy tale, but as an event. A thing that will happen. A thing the prophecy says must happen. The giant beast covering the skies. That's the Nidhoggr. That's Loki's transformation. That's been confirmed in the Elbaf arc. The scale of the Nidhoggr in its fully manifested state is genuinely sky covering. It's not a metaphor. The dragon is large enough that the act of it existing in the air above you blots out the light. The sky gets covered. The prophecy is describing exactly what we see when Loki transforms. The sun god of liberation standing alongside it. That's Luffy, that's Gear 5, the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika, the sun god fruit, the drums of liberation, the Joy Boy legacy incarnated in the person who arrived at the appointed time. Luffy, slow down. Now, sit with what this prophecy actually means as a piece of foreshadowing. Because the prophecy didn't emerge from the Elbaf arc. It predates it. It was part of Elbaf's cultural memory long enough that characters in the arc reference it as tradition, as something passed down. Which means that somewhere in Elbaf's history, someone foresaw this exact pairing. The Nidhoggr and the sun god, together, fighting the same enemy. And the most likely origin of that foresight is the Void Century. Because the Void Century is where all of One Piece's deepest prophetic lore comes from. The connection between Joy Boy and the giants. The promise Joy Boy made and couldn't keep. The alliance that was supposed to exist 800 years ago, but wasn't sufficient. That alliance included the giants of Elbaf. That alliance included whoever held the God of War title at that time. And in the aftermath of Joy Boy's defeat, someone in Elbaf's tradition preserved the memory of what was supposed to happen in the form of prophecy, the Sun God and the God of War together. Next time. When the appointed time comes, they'll be together. And now we're in the appointed time. And the Sun God and the God of War are at Elbaf simultaneously. That's not just foreshadowing within the Elbaf arc. That's foreshadowing that the arc inherits from 800 years of One Piece world history. The prophecy is the Void Century's message to the present, and it describes Luffy and Loki standing side by side. Pause beat. And here's where the drums of liberation and the drums of oppression fit into this. Because I talked about these in the Emu video, and I want to bring them into the Loki analysis because I think the three-way connection between Luffy's power, Imu's power, and Loki's power is something Oda has been constructing very deliberately. Luffy's Gear 5 creates the drums of liberation, the heartbeat of the Sun God, the sound of freedom made literal. The world comes alive around it with joy and liberation. Things dance, things celebrate. It's the sonic expression of what Nika represents. Emu's presence creates the drums of oppression, the inverted version. The same type of supreme awakened power expressing itself through the environment, but with horror instead of joy. The world comes alive around Imu with screaming evil faces and monstrous distortions. It's the anti-liberation, the anti-sun. And now there's the God of War, Loki and the Nidhoggr. What does the world sound like when a dragon the size of a country appears in the sky? What's the sonic character of that moment? And I think the answer Oda is building toward is something that's neither liberation nor oppression, but destruction. Focused destruction. The sound of the world tree being gnawed at. The sound of foundations giving way. The sound of the architecture of the existing power structure being dismantled. 3 supreme powers. 3 different relationships to reality. The Sun God brings liberation. The Sea Devil brings oppression. The Nidhoggr brings destruction. And in the final battle, 2 of those 3 are aligned against the third. The drums of liberation and the drums of destruction, pointed together at the drums of oppression. That's the endgame structure the prophecy describes. That's what the God of War means in the context of the final war. Not random destruction. Not world ending for its own sake, destruction in service of freedom. The Nidhoggr gnawing at the roots of the world government's power the same way it gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil. Until the structure falls. Pause beat. Let me now go deeper on something I touched on earlier but want to fully develop. The question of why Loki ate the Nidhoggr fruit. Because this is the piece of Loki's backstory that the Elbaf arc is still unraveling. And I think the foreshadowing we've covered today actually gives us strong evidence for what the real story is. Even if we don't have every detail confirmed yet. What we know. 14 years ago, the Orist Castle massacre. Loki was present. Loki's father Jarul died. Loki ate the Nidhoggr fruit during or immediately following these events. And in the aftermath, Loki was imprisoned under the Adam Tree. The official narrative in Elbaf became that Loki killed his father. That he was dangerous, that he was cursed, that he was the shame of Elbaf. Now here's what the accursed prince pattern tells us about this. Every time Oda has deployed this specific pattern, the official narrative has been wrong. Robin didn't bring death to everything she touched. Ace wasn't condemned by his bloodline. The official story, in each case, served the interests of whoever had power to gain from the cursed character being seen as monstrous. So who has power to gain from Loki being seen as the murderer of his father? From Loki being imprisoned? from Elbaf's most powerful warrior being locked away under the Adam Tree, rather than free to use the Nidhoggr fruit. The world government has everything to gain from this. The Holy Knights have everything to gain from this. The political forces that want Elbaf weakened and contained have everything to gain from this. And the Orrust Castle massacre. The castle name. Orrust. Harold's death. 14 years ago. These details don't read like a straightforward patricide committed by a monstrous son. They read like a crime scene that someone else was present at, and that Loki has been taking the blame for. The way Robin took the blame for O'Hara. The way Ace took the blame for his birth. Pause. Beat. I want to be honest that this is theory territory more than confirmed fact. The Elbaf arc is still developing, and I'm not going to present speculation as settled canon, but I will say this. The structural foreshadowing around the Accursed Prince pattern is strong enough that I'd be genuinely surprised if the story goes any other direction. Oda doesn't deploy that specific pattern only to subvert it the one time. The pattern exists because it pays off the same way. Robin was innocent. Ace was innocent. Loki's true story is something other than what Elbaf's official history says it is. And the foreshadowing of that truth was built into the Accursed Prince epithet from the moment it was first applied to him. Pause beat. Now let me talk about something that connects the Loki analysis to a broader point about how Oda constructs his endgame. Because I think there's a lesson in the Loki foreshadowing that goes beyond just this specific character and applies to everything that's still to come in One Piece. The lesson is this. In One Piece, cultural details are always real. Mythology is always real. When a character describes the legends of their people, those legends are describing actual things that exist in the world of the story. Not metaphors, not flavor, actual things. We've known this theoretically for a long time. The Joy Boy lore was dismissed as mythology for years before it was confirmed as history. The Void Sentry was treated as mythology before it was confirmed as history. The Will of D was treated as legend before it was confirmed as lineage. Over and over again, things that read as cultural mythology turn out to be factual information about the world of One Piece presented in the Register of Legend because that's what legends are. Factual history that got passed down in the form of stories because the true history was suppressed. And the God of War is the same. In 1999 it read as mythology, as cultural flavor, as a generic Norse reference in a series drawing from Norse aesthetics for the giants. But it was factual. It was describing an actual position held by an actual person who would appear 27 years later. The mythology was the history. The legend was the fact. The seed was the promise. Pause beat. So here's the question that follows from that lesson. What other cultural details from this series are still waiting to be understood as facts rather than mythology? What else is Oda hiding in the Register of Legend that's actually a description of something real? And I want to throw one out before we close, because it's something I've been thinking about since we started really digging into the Loki material, and I think it connects directly to where One Piece is heading. The legend of the sun god, Nika, the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika, the ancient name for what was called the Gomu Gomu no Mi. We know this fruit existed for centuries before Luffy ate it. We know the world government was hunting it for generations. We know the fruit has the specific property of containing Joy Boy's will and passing it to its next user. We know that Joy Boy himself appears to have been the first person to embody what Nika represents. But we don't actually know what Nika is in its original form. We know what the fruit does. We know what Luffy looks like in Gear 5. We know the drums of liberation and the sun god imagery. But the actual origin mythology of Nika, the story of what this being was before it became a devil fruit, before it became a legend people pray to, before it was the name of something the world government suppressed for centuries, that's still unclear. And the Loki foreshadowing teaches us that when One Piece has a gap like that in its mythology, the gap usually has something in it. The God of War gap had a dragon fruit and a prince. The Nika gap probably has something too. Pause beat. I'm not going to speculate on what it is. That's a different video and frankly probably its own series of videos. But I mention it because the methodology of this analysis, the practice of looking at One Piece's cultural and mythological details as factual information rather than aesthetic decoration, is the methodology that breaks these mysteries open. And if you take that methodology and apply it to the remaining gaps in the Nika mythology, to the things about Joy Boy's era that still don't have clear explanations, you will find threads worth pulling. That's the thing about Oda's 27 years of planning. It's not just that he planned Loki. It's not just that he planned Imu. It's that he planned the entire endgame, the whole interconnected architecture of the final war, and every piece of it has breadcrumbs leading to it from decades earlier. We're reading the breadcrumbs now. We're finally at the point in the story where the things that were planted in 1999 are flowering. And the sheer density of it, the sheer number of threads resolving simultaneously in the Elbaf arc, is genuinely unlike anything else in manga history. Pause beat. Let me also address something that I think deserves attention before we close out the first half of this analysis. And that's the specific question of what Loki's role is in the final arc going forward, because the prophecy tells us he fights alongside Luffy. But the how of that alliance is something the foreshadowing can actually give us more information about than just the stated prediction. Loki is impulsive. We established this through the Whole Cake Island introduction. He acts on feeling rather than calculation. He fell in love and proposed marriage with apparently very little context. He ate a world-ending devil fruit during a massacre, which is not a calculated strategic move. These are the decisions of someone who lives in the emotional present rather than the strategic future. And Luffy is the same way. Pause beat. Luffy doesn't make political alliances by calculation. He doesn't assess strategic value and make rational decisions about who to befriend. He makes emotional connections. He sees something in a person. He decides they're worth fighting for or fighting alongside. And he commits completely. Nami, Zoro, Robin, Frankie. Every Straw Hat was an emotional decision first and a rational 1 second. Or honestly, sometimes not even a rational 1 second. Just an emotional one that worked out. Loki and Luffy are going to understand each other immediately. Two people who act on feeling, who are defined by their willingness to reach for the most extreme available option when someone they care about is at risk, who have both been dismissed or underestimated by the political structures around them. The giant who ate the dragon fruit to protect something or someone during a massacre. The rubber boy who became the sun god to protect his crewmates from a world government admiral. They're the same kind of person. And the prophecy says they stand together. The foreshadowing in their parallel character structures says that standing together is going to happen naturally, not through negotiation or political calculation. It's going to happen because they look at each other and recognize something. That's not just a thematic parallel Oda drew. That's set up for a specific moment, and the breadcrumbs for that moment were laid in chapter 858, when Oda described Loki as the prince who proposed marriage on feeling rather than strategy. Pause beat. All right, before we go into the second half of this analysis, I want to stop for a second. Because if this kind of forensic deep dive is your thing, if the 27 years of planning side of One Piece analysis is what you're here for, this is the channel for it. We did the full Imu foreshadowing breakdown recently, and that one is deeply worth watching in combination with this one, because the two analyses intersect in several places. Imu and Loki are the opposing forces in the final arc in different ways, and a lot of what we mapped about Imu's design foreshadowing connects to the prophecy and the God of War setup we've been covering today. Drop a like on this one and subscribe if you want the full forensic picture as Elbaf develops. We're going to be here for every chapter. Pause beat. Okay, I want to do something now that I think most Loki analyses skip, and that's talk about what the God of War title means for Elbaf's political structure. Because understanding the politics helps you understand why the foreshadowing was structured the way it was. Why Oda planted what he planted when he planted it. Elbaf is not a democracy. It's a warrior culture with a hereditary royal line and a deeply embedded martial tradition. The most important political and cultural authority in Elbaf comes from demonstrated strength, from the ability to protect the people, from embodying the warrior ideal. And the God of War title sits at the top of that value system. It's the ultimate expression of what Elbaf values, and the God of War title is tied to the Nidhoggr fruit, which means that for as long as the fruit has been in Elbaf's possession, the holder of the fruit has been the holder of the ultimate authority in the culture's value system. The God of War isn't just a title, it's the political legitimacy of Elbaf's strongest warrior made concrete. The person who is the God of War is the person who is supposed to protect Elbaf from everything that threatens it. And Loki, the accursed prince, is that person. Has been that person since he ate the fruit 14 years ago. And for 6 years of that, he's been imprisoned under the Adam tree. Elbaf's God of War has been in chains. Elbaf's supreme protector has been locked away. And the culture that values strength above everything has been without its ultimate warrior for 6 years, because of a crime that, based on the accursed prince pattern, may not be the crime it's been presented as. Think about what that means for the people of Elbaf, for the warriors who revere the God of War title, for the cultural tradition that's been telling the story of the sun god and the God of War standing together. They've had a God of War in a cage, while the rest of the world was moving toward the appointed time. While the sun god was waking up, while Emu was moving, while everything was accelerating. And the Elbaf arc is the arc where that changes, where Loki gets out of the cage, where the Nidhoggr is freed, where the prophecy starts becoming the present tense rather than the future tense. Pause beat. The political implications of Loki's imprisonment also connect back to the foreshadowing we covered about the world government's interest in Elbaf specifically. Because here's the thing, the world government has been unable to subjugate Elbaf. The giants are too powerful. The Nidhoggr in particular is too much of a deterrent. But if the God of War, the person who holds the Nidhoggr, is imprisoned, if the one force that makes Elbaf genuinely untouchable is locked away, then Elbaf becomes significantly more vulnerable. The Orist Castle massacre and the subsequent imprisonment of Loki conveniently removed Elbaf's most dangerous military asset from the board. The world government may not have caused that situation directly, but I'd be very surprised if they didn't benefit from it. If they didn't do things in the aftermath that reinforced and extended the imprisonment rather than questioning it. And the Holy Knight's involvement in Elbaf's recent history is looking increasingly relevant to this picture, which is also something the foreshadowing was pointing at, just from a different angle. The consistent positioning of Elbaf as the one free culture the world government couldn't break. The consistent emphasis on the God of War as the source of Elbaf's military deterrence. And then the sudden removal of the God of War from active status through a politically convenient scandal. The setup was decades in the making, and the payoff is happening right now. Pause beat. Let me now talk about the complete design picture of Loki as a character, because I think the visual and conceptual construction of him is worth appreciating as a whole before we close out. Loki's name, Norse mythology, the trickster god, the shapeshifter, the father of monsters, the catalyst for Ragnarok, the one who was eventually bound in chains as punishment for going too far. Every element of the mythological Loki maps onto One Piece's Loki in a way that is too precise to be coincidental. Trickster. Loki's unpredictability, his impulsive behavior, the way his actions always seem to create more chaos than the people around him can manage. The accursed prince whose very presence generates political disruption. The person whose marriage proposal toppled a potential alliance. These are trickster qualities in the sense that a trickster's energy is uncontrollable and has unpredictable downstream effects. Father of monsters, the Nidhoggr, a world-ending beast. The mythological Loki's most famous children are Fenrir the wolf and the Midgard serpent, both of which are world-destroying monsters in Norse mythology. One Piece's Loki carries the world-ending dragon fruit, He is literally the bearer of the monster that could destroy the world. Catalyst for Ragnarok. This is the one that I think is most important for the endgame. In Norse mythology, Loki is the one whose actions trigger the events that lead to Ragnarok, the destruction and renewal of the world. He's not the destroyer himself. He's the catalyst. The one whose freedom or whose action sets in motion the chain of events that results in the old world ending and a new one beginning. And in One Piece, Loki freed at Elbaf, Loki and Luffy fighting together against the world government is exactly that, the catalyst for the One Piece version of Ragnarok, the final war, the end of the 800-year world order that Imu built and bound in chains. The mythological Loki was eventually captured and bound in chains as punishment for his transgressions in a cave with venom dripping onto him until Ragnarok began and the chains broke. One Piece's Loki was imprisoned beneath the Adam Tree, in chains, for 6 years, waiting for the appointed time. Oda chose the name Loki, knowing all of this. He named him knowing exactly what the mythological resonances would be, and every one of those resonances maps directly onto what Loki is and does in the story. That's not coincidence. That's naming as foreshadowing. Pause beat. And then there's the weapon. Ragnir, the hammer. And here I want to go back to Little Garden one more time, because this specific detail from the 1999 chapters is the one that, to me, most clearly demonstrates that the hammer detail in Dorian Brogi's description of Elbaf's god of war tradition was not generic Norse mythology flavor. It was a character sheet for a specific person. In Norse mythology, the hammer is Thor's domain. Thor's hammer Mjolnir is the iconic weapon. The hammer that can only be lifted by the worthy. The hammer that returns to its master's hand. The hammer associated with thunder and lightning and divine authority. But Loki is not Thor. In Norse mythology, Loki and Thor are very different figures. Loki is the trickster. Thor is the warrior. And yet One Piece's Loki carries a hammer. The god of war of Elbaf carries the hammer that the hammer tradition in Norse mythology is associated with. Why? Why does the trickster carry the warrior's weapon? Because in One Piece's version of the Norse mythology, Loki is both. He is the trickster by temperament and the warrior by power. He is the one who shouldn't be the god of war based on his personality, the impulsive emotional prince who acts before he thinks, and is the god of war anyway, because he's the one who carries the fruit. The hammer in his hands is the visual statement of that contradiction. The trickster wielding the warrior's weapon. The accursed prince carrying the god of war's title. And Dory and Brogy described this in 1999. They described the hammer-wielding god of war who transforms into a dragon. They were describing Loki. They just described him 27 years early. Pause beat. I want to bring this all home now with something that I think is the most emotionally resonant part of the entire Loki foreshadowing analysis, because we've been focused on the cleverness of the construction, on the specific chapter numbers and the specific details and the specific ways Oda planted this across decades. And all of that is real and it all matters. But there's a human element to the Loki story that I think the foreshadowing was always pointing toward, and that the Elbaf arc is now delivering. Loki is a person who was given the most dangerous power in Elbaf's history. Given it not through inheritance or through a ceremonial process or through the deliberate choice to step into a legendary role. Given it in the worst possible moment, during a massacre, at the worst night of his life, in the act of trying to do something, to save something or someone, that went catastrophically wrong or that was interpreted catastrophically wrong or both, and in the aftermath of consuming the Nidhoggr, he wasn't celebrated as the god of war. He was imprisoned as the shame of Elbaf. The culture that should have been saying thank you for holding this power had Loki in chains under the Adam Tree for 6 years. The most powerful person in Elbaf's history, the living fulfillment of a prophecy that dates back to the Void Century, was locked up because the truth of what happened at Horus Castle was suppressed or misunderstood or weaponized by people with interests in keeping Loki contained. Slow down. And through all of that, The prophecy still existed. Somebody had written it down. Somebody had preserved the knowledge that one day the god of war and the sun god would stand together. That the giant beast would cover the skies alongside the liberator. Even when the god of war was in chains, the prophecy was in the cultural memory, waiting, trusting that the appointed time would come, trusting that the person under the Adam tree was still the person the prophecy described. That's the emotional core of Loki's story. Not the cool dragon transformation, not the impressive scale, the fact that he has been carrying the weight of a world-ending power and a prophetic destiny in a cage under a tree for 6 years while the world moved around him. And now the cage is open. And the sun god is at Elbaf. And the prophecy is present tense. Oda built that emotional arc over 27 years. The god of war mention in 1999 was not just a plot seed. It was the first chapter of Loki's story. The chapter where the title that would define him, imprison him, redeem him, and ultimately make him one of the most important figures in the final war, was first spoken aloud. Pause beat. Now. Let me also address something before we close out. The question of what happens after. Because the prophecy tells us Loki and Luffy fight together, but it doesn't tell us what comes after the fight. And I think the foreshadowing actually gives us some strong indicators here. The mythological Loki's role in Ragnarok is interesting because he doesn't survive it cleanly. Ragnarok in Norse mythology is a mutual destruction event. Many of the major figures die. The world ends. And then a new world rises from the wreckage. The survivors are few. The new world is made from the remnants. In One Piece terms, I don't think this maps to Loki dying. One Piece is ultimately not a tragedy. It's about liberation and freedom and the expansive joy of discovery. The series that created the drums of liberation doesn't end with the god of war consumed by the destruction he unleashed. But I do think Ragnarok as a structural template suggests transformation rather than simple victory. The world after the final war is not the same as the world before it. The world government's fiction collapses. The true history becomes known. The power structures that have existed for 800 years are dismantled, and in that new world, the God of War title might mean something different. The Nidhoggr that gnaws at the roots of the old structure might find that when the old structure falls, there are no more roots to gnaw. That destruction in service of liberation eventually has to make way for construction, for the new world that grows from what Luffy and Loki together brought down. The foreshadowing in the name Nidhoggr is interesting here. In some Norse sources, Nidhoggr survives Ragnarok. It flies away, carrying the bodies of the dead. Its role continues. It's not destroyed by the end of the old world. It persists into the new one, changed, but continuing. One Piece is Loki surviving the final war and entering the new era, still holding the Nidhoggr fruit, still carrying the God of War title, but in a world where that title can mean something different now, something less about deterrence and more about legacy. That's a possible ending for him, and the name Nidhoggr was pointing at it from the beginning. Pause beat. Let me now do the thing we did with the Imu analysis. Let me lay out the complete foreshadowing timeline with chapter numbers, because I think seeing it all in one place hits differently than processing it piece by piece. Chapter 1, 116, 1999. Little Garden, God of War title mentioned. Hammer-wielding dragon transformer described. Oda plants Loki's title and power 27 years early. Chapters 655 through 699, 2012. Punk Hazard. Western-style artificial dragons. The world government's research into the specific dragon type that corresponds to the Nidhoggr. Oda plants the institutional context for why the world government has been preparing for this power. Chapter 8, 158, 2017. Whole Cake Island, Loki named. Elbaf's prince, impulsive romantic. His actions have kingdom-level political consequences. Oda introduces the character disguised as Big Mom backstory. Throughout the Adam Tree references across multiple arcs, the most legendary wood in the world, ships and weapons, the material connecting the greatest sailors in One Piece history. Oda builds the Yggdrasil parallel across decades before Loki is chained to its roots. Chapter 1. 1142 onward, 2025. The Elbaf arc. Nidhoggr confirmed. Ratatoskr confirmed. Prophecy confirmed. Adam Tree as Yggdrasil confirmed. Everything pays off simultaneously, and in the cultural subtext throughout. Every mention of Elbaf from any character who knew anything about the giant culture. Every reference to the God of War tradition. Every hint at the Adam Tree's significance. All of it accumulating toward this. 27 years. Specific seeds. Consistent payoff. Pause beat. And now, let me close with the thing that I think matters most beyond the chapter numbers and the design connections and the mythological parallels. Because all of that is impressive. All of that demonstrates craft and planning and long-form vision. But the thing that makes Loki's foreshadowing matter at a deeper level than just impressive construction is what it means for the people who've been reading this series for a long time. For anyone who read Little Garden in 1999, who met Dory and Brogy, who absorbed the description of the God of War as casual world-building and moved on. 27 years later, that description came alive. The thing you processed as flavor was real. The seed you didn't know was being planted in you is now in bloom. That's what Oda does. And it's not just a clever structural thing. It's a relationship with the reader. It's Oda trusting that the people who have been with him from the beginning deserve a payoff that's equal to the time they invested. That the God of War line from 1999 deserves to mean something specific and important and emotionally resonant in 2026. Not just to be a clever Easter egg that only the most obsessive researchers would find, but to be the thing that, when you hear it explained, makes you feel like you were always part of the story, like your childhood reading of chapter 116 was already the beginning of Loki's chapter. The seeds Oda plants aren't just for him to harvest, they're for us. For the reader who will someday have the context to understand what was in the ground all along. Pause beat. I found, going through this research, that every single major element of Loki's character and power traces back to a seed that predates his appearance by at least several years. The title, the weapon, the fruit type, the guardian mythology, the world tree connection, the imprisonment parallel, the accursed prince pattern, the prophecy, the character personality. All of it was already in the series, waiting for Loki to arrive and complete the picture, and there are still mysteries to resolve. Loki's full role in the final arc is unfolding right now. The truth of Horus Castle is still being revealed. The question of whether Loki can fully control the Nidhoggr's destructive nature, or whether the fruit will push against his control in moments of extremity, is still open. The specific form that the God of War and the Sun God fighting together will take is still ahead of us. But the foundation of who Loki is and what he represents was laid 27 years ago. The blueprint existed before the building went up. And now that we can see the building, the blueprint is the most beautiful thing about it. Pause beat. This has been Anime Autopsy. We found every piece of foreshadowing of Loki's Nidhoggr fruit and the God of War title. Oda planted it in 1999 and kept planting for 27 years, and now we all see it. If you made it this far, drop in the comments which seed blew your mind the hardest. For me, it's still chapter 116 and the God of War description. Dory and Brogy told us everything. We just didn't know how to read it. Like and subscribe if you want the full ongoing forensic analysis of the Elbaf arc as it develops, and the companion video on how Loki and Luffy's specific alliance is going to work mechanically in the final war is coming soon. I'll see you there. Alright, I want to go back and fill in something that I glossed over too quickly in the first half, and that I think deserves its own deep analysis. Because we've been talking about the God of War title, and the Nidhoggr fruit, and the mythological architecture and the character level foreshadowing. But there's another category of foreshadowing that I find equally important, and that connects Loki to the rest of the series in ways that go beyond just Elbaf's internal mythology. I want to talk about the behavioral and institutional foreshadowing, the way the world government has been acting around Elbaf for the entire series. Because if you look at the world government's relationship with the giants, not as random antagonism, but as a deliberate, strategic management of a specific threat, the Nidhoggr starts showing up everywhere as the organizing principle. Think about the warlord system. One of the things the warlord system does structurally is co-opt extreme individual power into state service. The idea is that rather than fighting someone who's too dangerous to fight directly, you give them a title and nominal control and let them operate under the umbrella of your authority. Crocodile, Mihawk, Doflamingo. All of these are people who, as enemies, would be genuinely dangerous to the world government's interests. As warlords, their power is redirected, neutralized through incorporation. The world government never extended warlord status to any giant from Elbaf. Never. Not once across the entire run of the series. Giants are available as mercenaries. They show up in various contexts as hired muscle. But the specific arrangement of formal world government alliance with an Elbaf giant of the kind that would bring Elbaf's military power under the world government's umbrella, that has never happened. Why? Because the specific thing the world government would want from such an alliance, which is control over the god of war and the Nidhoggr fruit, is not something Elbaf would ever agree to. The god of war title and the Nidhoggr fruit are not negotiable. They're not tradable assets. They're the sacred core of Elbaf's entire cultural identity and the literal source of the culture's highest value. You can't broker a deal that puts the god of war under someone else's authority, because the god of war's authority is the ultimate authority in the culture that produced it. The world government's inability to bring Elbaf into formal alliance is specifically about the Nidhoggr. The one thing they want is the one thing Elbaf would never surrender. Pause beat. And that institutional frustration has been expressed through a different strategy. Not alliance, containment, limitation, making the god of war unable to exercise their power through political means rather than direct confrontation. And the Orist Castle situation, whatever it truly was, resulted in exactly that. The god of war in chains. The Nidhoggr fruit locked under the Adam tree with its user. The world government didn't need to defeat Loki. They just needed to keep him in that cage long enough. Long enough for the situation to become the accepted reality in Elbaf. Long enough for the shame of Elbaf narrative to become entrenched. Long enough to keep the deterrent neutralized while other preparations were made. And the Elbaf arc is the story of that calculation failing. Of Loki getting out of the cage at exactly the wrong time for the world government. Right when the sun god is at Elbaf. Right when the prophecy is ready to become present tense. Right when every preparation the world government made against the possibility of Loki and Luffy fighting together doesn't matter anymore, because Loki and Luffy are already in the same place and already understand each other. Pause, beat. This institutional foreshadowing is different from the character design foreshadowing or the mythological architecture foreshadowing. It's not about a specific detail from a specific chapter. It's about the logic of the world government's behavior across the series being consistent with a specific threat they've been managing. And that threat is the Nidhoggr. The thing they couldn't replicate, couldn't suppress, couldn't co-opt, could only hope to keep imprisoned through political manipulation. And the moment Loki walks out of that imprisonment is the moment the entire strategy unravels. Pause beat. I also want to spend time on something that I find genuinely fascinating about the timing of Loki's introduction. Because Chapter 8, 158 drops in 2017 and gives us Loki's name and basic character profile, and 2017 is important context, right? Because 2017 is also around the time the Elbaf arc starts coming into focus as a definite planned destination for the series. Not immediate, but clearly on the horizon. Oda was clearly building toward it. The Big Mom arc and the Whole Cake Island arc were deepening the giant mythology. The connection between the giants and the final arc was becoming visible. And in that context, Chapter 858's introduction of Loki reads differently. It's not just background information about Big Mom's marriage schemes, it's Oda saying explicitly that the Prince of Elbaf exists. He has a specific personality, and he's going to matter. It's the first panel of a character sheet that he's going to keep filling in across the next 7 years. And here's something that I think is worth noting about how Oda staged that introduction. He introduced Loki through Lola's story, through Big Mom's grievance, through the political rupture that one giant's marriage proposal created. He introduced Loki as the cause of a consequence rather than as a character directly. You hear about Loki through what he caused rather than through who he is. And that's a very specific choice because it tells you something about Loki before you've met him. It tells you that Loki's decisions have enormous downstream effects, that his personal choices, made from feeling rather than from strategy, create political situations that ripple outward for years. That's not just a character quirk, that's a warning. This is a person whose emotional directness is capable of reshaping the geopolitical landscape. And in the endgame context, that quality is going to express itself through the Nidhoggr, through the decision to transform and point that power somewhere. The same impulsive emotional directness that caused Lola to run away is going to be the quality that, at the appointed time, makes Loki point the world-ending dragon at the world government without hesitation. Because that's who he is. He acts on feeling. And when his feelings align with the prophecy, when the fight is right and the ally is Luffy and the enemy is the world government that's been keeping him in a cage, there's going to be no hesitation at all. Pause beat. Let me now talk about something specific to the Elbaf arc's visual construction that I think constitutes its own category of foreshadowing. And that's the giant mural. The ancient artwork in Elbaf. The mural that depicts figures from what appears to be the Void Century or earlier. The imagery on it has been discussed a lot in the community from the perspective of Joy Boy and the sun god mythology. But there's a figure in that mural that I think hasn't gotten enough attention in the context of Loki specifically. There is a massive presence in the mural, a vast shape, something enormous, depicted with what appears to be wings and scale that dwarfs the humanoid figures around it. And in the context of what chapter 1142 and the following chapters revealed, the most natural reading of that enormous presence is the Nidhoggr, the god of war's dragon transformation, the giant beast that covers the skies. If that reading is correct, then Oda drew the Nidhoggr into Elbaf's oldest artifacts. The culture that has had the prophecy has had the image of the dragon alongside the sun god in their sacred art for centuries. The mural was already telling the story. We just needed the reveal to understand what we were looking at. And here's the thing about that. The mural predates the current political situation. It predates Loki's birth. It predates the Nidhoggr fruit being in Ratatoskr's keeping. The image in the mural is from a time when the god of war was a figure of history or mythology rather than a living person, which suggests the Nidhoggr has appeared in Elbaf's sacred art because it appeared in Elbaf's actual history, because the god of war and the sun god fought together before. In the Void Century, and Elbaf has been carrying the image of that alliance ever since. Pause beat. The Void Century alliance between Joy Boy and the Giants. We know Joy Boy had allies. We know his attempt to keep his promise required a coalition that ultimately wasn't sufficient. And Elbaf, as the most powerful single culture in the world that operates outside the world government's control, almost certainly was part of that coalition. The god of war 800 years ago fought alongside Joy Boy. The prophecy was written by someone who witnessed that alliance, and the image in the mural was made by someone who wanted to preserve the memory of it, not as mythology, as history, as the record of something that happened and was supposed to happen again. And 800 years later, here we are. The sun god has returned. The god of war is freed. And the mural is about to become the present tense. That's visual foreshadowing, operating not just across chapters but across the entire history of the One Piece world. Oda put the image of this alliance in the oldest art in Elbaf, Because the oldest art in Elbaf is the most honest record of what the world is building toward. Pause beat. Now let me bring something in that connects the Loki analysis specifically to the Imu material we covered in the previous video. Because these two analyses aren't separate. They're the same story from two different angles, and understanding how they connect makes both hit harder. Imu and Loki are, in a specific structural sense, the opposing anchors of the final arc, not Luffy and Imu, not Luffy and Loki, Imu and Loki. The supreme ruler of the world government whose power comes from somewhere ancient and terrible, and the god of war of Elbaf whose power is the mythological destroyer of the world tree. These two forces, Imu's oppressive 800-year-old control and Loki's world-ending destruction, are the power scales that define the final war. And here's the structural point that I find most compelling. The world government has been preparing for two specific individual powers for its entire history. The return of Joy Boy, of the sun god, of the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika, and the potential unleashing of the god of war, the Nidhoggr. These are the two things that, in the world government's long-term threat assessment, represent the forces capable of dismantling what Imu built. Imu screamed when Joy Boy's haki reached Mary Joyce. The specific pain of recognizing the haki of the one person who genuinely threatened him 800 years ago. That's the sun god problem from Imu's perspective, and the world government has been managing the Nidhoggr problem through institutional manipulation, through keeping the god of war title's holder contained, through the Orus Castle situation and its political aftermath, through 6 years of Loki in chains while other pieces were moved. Both of Imu's greatest threats are now at Elbaf simultaneously. The prophecy is simultaneously the thing Imu has been trying to prevent for 800 years. And it's happening anyway, despite everything. Despite the warlord system and the cipher pole and the marine infrastructure and the seraphim and the 5 elders and 8 centuries of managing every threat before it could converge on this exact moment. It's happening because Luffy is there, and because Loki is there, and because the appointed time is the appointed time, Lesa. Pause beat. I want to spend some time on the Ratatoskr relationship to Loki specifically, because I think there's a layer here about what the Guardian mythology means for Loki as a person that most analyses don't go deep enough on. Ratatoskr didn't just guard the fruit. Ratatoskr was in relationship with the fruit, with what the fruit represented, with the power that was supposed to be released at the right time. And in Norse mythology, Ratatoskr's role is specifically about being the intermediary between the eagle above and the dragon below, between the high power and the chthonic power, between order and chaos, between the structure and the thing that destroys the structure. In One Piece terms, Ratatoskr, as the guardian of the Nidhoggr, is the entity that has been maintaining the relationship between the god of war's power and the world above, keeping the fruit safe until the conditions for its use were right. Understanding at some level that the Nidhoggr isn't meant to be permanently contained, it's meant to be released, at the right time, in the right company, and the right company is Luffy. When Ratatoskr's guardianship ends, when the fruit has been eaten and the prophecy is in motion, the squirrel's job is done. The message has been delivered. The intermediary between the dragon below and the sun above has completed their function. The dragon and the sun are in the same place. The rest is the story. That's what the Norse mythology is encoding about Loki's relationship to his own power. It's not his to keep contained. It's not a burden he carries alone. The fruit was always waiting for the moment when the alliance described in the prophecy was ready to form. Ratatoskr was holding it until that moment, and the moment is now. Pause beat. Let me also talk about the sun mythology itself in the context of Loki, because one of the things I find most beautiful about the prophecy is the way it positions Loki's destruction in relation to Luffy's liberation. These are not parallel forces, they're not equivalent, they're sequential. You need the liberation before you can build something new, but you also need the destruction before the liberation has a world to create. The old structure has to come down before the new one can go up. The world government's 800-year architecture of control and suppression has to be dismantled before the freedom Luffy represents can actually be exercised in a lasting way. Joy Boy promised things that couldn't be kept because the structure that prevented them from being kept was still standing. The Nidhoggr gnaws at that structure. Luffy brings liberation. Loki brings the fall of what prevents liberation. The Sun God and the God of War aren't doing the same thing. They're doing sequential things in the right order. And the prophecy describes them doing those things together. Not because they're equivalent powers, because the fall and the freedom are two movements of the same necessary process. The foreshadowing of this dynamic was in the name itself. Nidhoggr, the destroyer of the world tree, not the destroyer of everything, not random apocalyptic destruction. The destruction of the specific structure, the gnawing at the roots of the thing that's been holding the old order in place. And when the roots give way, the tree falls, and the sun god is there to plant something new in the light. Pause beat. I want to address something I've been building toward this whole analysis, and that I think is the central question of the Loki foreshadowing. Not where was it planted? We've covered that. The central question is, what does the fact that it was planted, this deliberately tell us about how the endgame is going to resolve? Because if Oda has been building Loki since chapter 116 in 1999, if the God of War has been a character in Oda's head for 27 years before Loki appeared on panel, then the resolution of Loki's story was mapped at the same time. The ending was written before the character was introduced, and that means every detail of the Loki foreshadowing is pointing at a specific resolution. Here's what I think the foreshadowing is telling us about where Loki ends up. The accursed prince pattern means redemption. Not just personal redemption, cultural redemption. Loki returning to his rightful place in Elbaf's story as the god of war who protected the culture rather than shamed it. The same way Robin was restored to her rightful place as a scholar and a member of the world rather than as a fugitive. The same way Ace's legacy was eventually honoured even after his death. The shame is lifted. The truth comes out. And what was called cursed is recognised as what it always was. The prophecy means victory, not a Pyrrhic victory, not a sacrifice. The prophecy describes the giant beast and the sun god standing together. You don't put those two in the same frame if one of them is about to die serving as a weapon. You put them there if both of them are going to be part of what happens after. The prophecy is a portrait of two survivors standing in the same light. The Nidhoggr's mythological survival past Ragnarok means Loki persists. The dragon at the roots of the world tree does not end with the destruction of the old world. It flies through the aftermath, carrying what was into what comes next. The destructive power of the god of war is part of the new world, not erased, transformed, given new meaning by the world that forms after the old one falls. Pause Beat and Joy Boy. The Void Sentry alliance that failed. The connection between the giants and the sun god that was supposed to win 800 years ago and didn't. The prophecy is the promise that this time will be different. That this time the sun god arrives at the appointed time, with enough allies, with the right people beside him. The giants were there 800 years ago, and it wasn't enough. The giants are here now. Loki specifically is here now. And this time, the god of war is free. This time, the dragon at the roots gets to gnaw. Pause beat. All right, let me do the full reverse engineering of every confirmed seed one more time, because I want to give you the whole picture in one clean pass. 1999, Chapter 116, Little Garden. The God of War title, hammer-wielding giant who becomes a dragon. The seed that proves this was always planned. The one that makes every subsequent plant undeniable in context. 2012. Chapters 655 through 699. Punk Hazard. Western artificial dragons. The institutional foreshadowing of the world government's awareness of and preparation for the Nidhoggr's specific design type. Kaido's Eastern Dragon was the cover. The Western Dragon experiments were also pointing at Elbaf's God of War. 2017, Chapter 8, 158. Whole Cake Island. Loki named. Character profile established. Emotional directness confirmed. Political weight established. The Prince of Elbaf is introduced as someone whose personal choices have world-level consequences. Across multiple arcs, the Adam Tree, the legendary wood of One Piece's greatest ships. Oda builds the Yggdrasil parallel across decades, positioning the world tree of his fictional mythology as the anchor for the dragon, who will eventually be chained at its roots. 2025 through 2026. Elbaf Arc. Everything resolves. Ratatoskr confirmed as the Nidhoggr's guardian. The fruit's history confirmed. The Adam Tree as Yggdrasil confirmed. The prophecy confirmed. Loki's transformation confirmed. The giant beast covers the skies alongside the sun god. The foreshadowing becomes the present tense. 27 years, every entry specific, every entry pointing at the same person. Pause beat. And here's what I find most remarkable about this, looking back at the full construction. The Little Garden arc in 1999 is often described by fans who are newer to the series as one of the slower, less essential arcs in the early stretch. It's sandwiched between Alabasta and Drum Island, and it doesn't have the obvious emotional punch of those surrounding stories. It's two giants who've been fighting for 100 years on a prehistoric island. It's charming, but it doesn't feel like it's carrying the same weight as what comes before and after it. And yet Chapter 116, quietly, contains the seed that proves Oda knew where this story was going, from essentially the beginning of the Grand Line saga. The God of War line from 1999 is the clearest possible proof of long-term planning in One Piece. Because it's not a vague thematic echo. It's not a design detail that could have been borrowed retroactively. It's a specific title, applied to a specific type of power in the specific cultural context that would eventually produce the character who holds that title and that power. It's a fact about Loki stated 27 years before Loki existed as a character the reader could see. That's what makes it the most important piece of evidence in this entire analysis. Everything else is corroboration. Chapter 116 is the proof. Pause beat. One more thing. Because this analysis has been focused on the foreshadowing of Loki's power and role. But I want to close with something about the foreshadowing of Loki's heart, of who he is beneath the title and the fruit and the prophecy. Because I think that's the part of the construction that people will feel most deeply when the full story lands. Loki is a person who loved someone enough to propose marriage before the political calculations were complete. Who acted on a feeling before a strategy. Who, in the worst moment of his life, during a massacre at Horus Castle, made a desperate choice that changed everything. Who has been sitting in a cage under a tree for 6 years while his people told a story about him that was wrong. And who is about to walk out of that cage at the appointed time and fight alongside the person the prophecy always said he'd fight alongside. There's something about that arc, from the Little Garden God of War mention to the Whole Cake Island introduction to the imprisonment to the liberation, that is deeply human. Not in spite of the massive mythological scale, because of it. The biggest powers in One Piece are always wielded by people who are deeply, recognizably human in their motivations. Luffy fights for his friends, Zoro fights for his dream, Robin fights for the world's right to know its own history, and Loki fights because he's a person who acts on feeling and has been prevented from doing so for 6 years by a cage and a lie. And when he finally gets out, when the sun god is there and the prophecy is ready, the feeling that drives him will be exactly the right feeling at exactly the right time. Oda built that across 27 years. From the God of War mention in Little Garden, to the impulsive prince in Whole Cake Island, to the accursed Prince Patton, to the prophecy that was always waiting for him. The construction of Loki's heart was as carefully planted as the construction of his power. And when the giant beast covers the skies alongside the sun god of liberation, both of them products of decades of patient planting, the payoff will be equal to the time it took to grow. Pause beat. This has been the second half of the Loki foreshadowing analysis, And I want to leave you with the same thought that closes every one of these deep dives. Every chapter of One Piece is a letter to the future. Every cultural detail, every cultural reference, every character name and title and epithet is a seed. We just have to learn how to read them. We just have to understand that when Oda mentions the God of War in chapter 116, he's not doing world building. He's making a promise. And 27 years later, he kept it. Chapter 116 was always about Loki. We just didn't know it yet. Pause beat. I found, going through this entire analysis, that every major element of Loki's character, his power, his title, his mythological architecture, his institutional role in the world government's threat model, his personality, his relationship to the prophecy, all of it traces back to a seed placed deliberately years before his appearance. Some seeds were planted in 1999, some in 2012, some in 2017. All of them were tended. All of them were always pointing at the same person. Oda has been writing the Elbaf arc for 27 years. He just finally had enough story around it to let it arrive. Drop in the comments what landed hardest for you. For me, it's still the Adam Tree connection. The most legendary wood in One Piece being the World Tree with the dragon chained at its roots. Decades of ships and legendary materials all being the same object. That one gets me every time. Like and subscribe for the full ongoing Elbaf arc forensic analysis. We are going to be deep in this arc for a long time, and I cannot wait to be there with you. I'll see you for the next one. Actually, hold on. I want to go back and dig into some things that I think we moved past too quickly. Because the structure document for this video lists several connection points I want to give the full treatment to. And some of the most interesting ones are the ones about the visual design specifically. The ones about how Loki looks and what every element of his visual construction is pointing at. Because here's the thing about Oda's design philosophy that becomes very clear when you analyze characters at this level of the story. By the endgame, by the time you're designing the final major players, every visual element is doing multiple jobs simultaneously. Its characterization, its thematic statement, its foreshadowing, and its mythological encoding, and all four of those layers are operating at the same time in the same design choice. Loki's design is one of the most layered in the series, and I want to go through it properly. Pause beat. Let's start with the color palette. Loki's visual identity is dark, deep blues and blacks, and the specific golden of his chains and his hammer. And that dark palette sits in specific relationship to the light palette of the characters he's being positioned against. Luffy's Gear 5 is white, bright, solar. The sun god imagery is all light, and against that, Loki is the deep of night and storm, the colors of the Norse world in winter, the dark sky before dawn. But here's what's interesting about that visual contrast in the context of the prophecy. The giant beast covering the skies isn't described as an enemy. It's described as standing alongside the sun god, which means the darkness of the Nidhoggr, the deep color palette of Loki's design, is not positioning him as an opposing force to Luffy's light. It's the sky at night, which is still the same sky. The darkness and the sun occupy the same sky at different times. And in the moment the prophecy describes, they're in it together. Darkness and light in the same frame, not at war, in alliance. Oda uses color to do this kind of thematic work constantly throughout the series. The contrast between visual palettes that appear opposed but are actually complementary. Robin's dark aesthetic alongside Luffy's brightness. Zoro's grey-green against Sanji's warm gold. Characters who seem to be in visual opposition until you understand their relationship, and then the contrast reads as completion rather than conflict. Loki and Luffy are the final expression of that pattern. Pause beat. Now let's talk about the chains. Because Loki's chains are not just a narrative element, they're a visual design choice that Oda made when he was constructing how Loki would appear in the Elbaf arc. And the chains are doing specific mythological and thematic work. In Norse mythology, the chaining of Loki is one of the central events of the tradition. After Loki's role in Baldur's death, the gods capture him and chain him inside a cave, with a serpent dripping venom on his face. He's held there until Ragnarok, until the appointed time, when the chains break and he's free to fulfill his final role in the cosmic drama. One Piece's Loki is chained under the Adam Tree, not in a cave, under the World Tree itself, which is, in the mythological structure Oda is using, actually more precise than the Norse original. The Nidhoggr gnaws at the roots of the World Tree. Loki is chained at those roots. The chaining is at the site where the power is supposed to be used. It's like putting a key in a lock and then locking the lockbox. And the chains being golden, specifically, is interesting. Gold, in One Piece's visual language, is associated with authority and divinity. The world government's symbols are gold. The celestial dragons wear gold. The formal trappings of the false divine authority that Emu constructed are rendered in gold. And the chains that hold Loki are gold, which means the visual reading of the chains is not just physical imprisonment. It's the authority structure literally binding the god of war. The world government's golden power literally chaining Elbaf's greatest warrior. And when those chains break, when Loki walks free, the visual reading is that the golden authority has failed, that the world government's containment of this specific power has collapsed. The chains breaking isn't just a character freedom moment. It's a visual statement about the world government's ability to control the things it's been trying to control for 800 years. Pause beat. Now the hammer, Ragnir. Because I want to talk about this weapon in the context of what the design tells us about Loki's combat philosophy and how it connects to the foreshadowing from Little Garden. The hammer is a blunt instrument. It's not a sword. It's not a spear. It doesn't cut. It doesn't pierce. It impacts. It transfers force. The hammer hits things and the things deform or shatter or collapse from the concentrated force of the blow. And in the God of War context, in the Elbaf warrior tradition, the hammer represents a specific approach to combat that is different from the precise martial artistry of a sword or the reach and speed of a spear. The hammer is overwhelming force applied directly. It doesn't require finesse. It requires commitment. You swing a hammer with your whole body. You put everything into it. And when it connects, there's no question about what happened. The thing got hit. The thing absorbed the force. The thing changed. And that's Loki. That's who he is as a fighter and as a person. He doesn't outmaneuver. He doesn't strategize in the moment. He commits completely to what he decides and hits with everything he has. The proposal to Lola. The decision to eat the Nidhoggr. The imprisonment he's enduring rather than compromising his account of what happened. These are hammer decisions. All in. Fully committed. No half measures. The weapon encodes the person. And the foreshadowing of the hammer-wielding god of war from Little Garden was foreshadowing not just the weapon, but the character wielding it. The person who makes absolute commitments and follows through with absolute force. Pause beat. I want to now go deeper on the Shanks angle, because Shanks is at Elbaf. Shanks has been at Elbaf for a meaningful stretch of the arc, and Shanks' relationship with Loki is something that has been seeded in very specific ways. We know from the arc that there's a history between them, that Loki's imprisonment is somehow connected to a situation involving Shanks. That 6 years ago, around the time of the Castle massacre or shortly after, whatever happened that resulted in Loki being chained under the Adam Tree also involved Shanks. Now I want to be really careful here, because the full truth of what happened at Castle and what Shanks' role in the aftermath was is still unfolding as of this analysis. I'm not going to present speculation as confirmed fact, but I want to flag the foreshadowing that exists and what it's pointing at. Shanks has been introduced throughout the series as someone who operates on a completely different information level from everyone else. He knew about Blackbeard's danger before anyone else did. He warned Whitebeard. He had access to the Gorosei for a meeting about a specific person. He moved pieces around the board in ways that served purposes he never fully explained. Shanks is the character in One Piece who has always been working with more context than anyone else. And his presence at Elbaf, at the site where Loki is imprisoned during the arc where everything is converging, is not accidental. It never would be accidental with Shanks. Every place Shanks shows up is a place where something important is happening or is about to happen. He doesn't appear for decorative purposes. Pause beat. The foreshadowing around Shanks and Loki suggests one of two general interpretations. Either Shanks is partly responsible for Loki's imprisonment, having made some calculation about the timing or conditions under which the god of war should be freed. Or Shanks is at Elbaf specifically because he knows the imprisonment needs to end and he's there to facilitate or witness that ending. The two interpretations aren't mutually exclusive. Shanks might have made a hard choice about timing 6 years ago and is now there because the timing is finally right. And what the foreshadowing around Shanks in general tells us is that his information level, whatever the specifics turn out to be, connects to the same ancient sources that Joy Boy's legacy connects to. Shanks has been on the right ship at the right time too many times to be operating without information the rest of the fandom doesn't have. And at Elbaf, with Loki and Luffy both present and the prophecy ready to become reality, Shanks is there. Watching, maybe helping, definitely understanding what's happening in ways that most characters around him don't. The foreshadowing of Shanks' knowledge is built into every appearance he's ever made in the series. It's just that at Elbaf, finally, we're getting to see what some of that knowledge was about. Pause beat. Let me talk now about the sun imagery specifically, because I've been gesturing at the relationship between Loki's darkness and Luffy's solar aesthetic throughout this analysis, and I want to actually lay out what Oda built with the sun symbolism in the context of Elbaf. The sun is the most consistent symbolic motif in One Piece's endgame, the sun god, the drums of liberation, the imagery of warmth and freedom and life-giving energy associated with Joy Boy's legacy and with what Luffy carries. The sun is fundamentally the symbol of the side of freedom and liberation in One Piece's final battle. And Elbaf has a relationship with the sun that is ancient and specific. The giant's god is Nika, the sun god, according to the lore. The island has a sacred relationship with solar mythology that connects to the Void Century. The connection between the giants and Joy Boy's legacy runs through the sun. And the Nidhoggr is a creature of the roots, of the underground, of the gnawing at foundations that happens below the surface, in the dark, where the light doesn't reach. The dragon lives at the base of the world tree, underground, in shadow, not in sunlight. The Nidhoggr and the sun are not the same thing. But here's what the Norse mythology actually says about their relationship. The eagle who lives at the top of Yggdrasil and the Nidhoggr who lives at its roots are in opposition. The eagle sees everything from above, from the sky, from the light. The Nidhoggr works from below, from the roots, from the dark. They're enemies through Ratatoskr's mischief. They represent opposing cosmic principles, and yet in Ragnarok, both of them are present at the end. Both of them participate in the conclusion. The cosmic destruction that remakes the world involves both the light and the dark, the above and the below. Neither of them can accomplish it alone. The renewal requires both. In One Piece, the prophecy is saying the same thing. The sun, God alone, is not sufficient to end the world government's power. The god of war alone is not sufficient to liberate the world. You need the sun, and you need the dragon. You need liberation, and you need destruction. You need both the drums of freedom and the force that tears down the prison. Oda built this through 27 years of solar and chthonic imagery running in parallel. The sun mythology of Joy Boy and the root mythology of the Nidhoggr, two traditions that seem opposed and are actually complementary, two forces that seem like enemies and are actually allies. And the prophecy is the moment where both of those traditions recognize themselves as parts of the same story. Pause beat. Now let me bring in something that I think is the most interesting design level foreshadowing in the series that connects to Loki specifically. And that's the way that giant aesthetic in One Piece has always operated visually. The giants of Elbaf have a specific design language that's distinctly different from any other culture in One Piece. The Viking aesthetic, the massive scale, the specific weaponry, the mythology-derived naming, and running through all of it, from Dorry and Brogy in Little Garden to the giants at Thriller Bark, to the giant officers at Marineford, to the Elbaf arc itself, there is a consistent visual vocabulary that Oda has been building. And Loki is the culmination of that visual vocabulary. He takes every element of the giant aesthetic and elevates it to a mythological register. The hammer that's always been part of the warrior tradition becomes Ragnir. The dragon imagery that runs through Norse mythology becomes the Nidhoggr transformation. The warrior culture that values strength above all else produces the one warrior whose strength is literally world-ending. But here's the thing. The visual vocabulary of the giants was established in Chapter 115, right before the God of War was mentioned in Chapter 116. Oda built the aesthetic first, then planted the seed of the character who would embody the full expression of that aesthetic. The visual language was the foundation. Loki is the structure built on it. And that's a specific kind of foreshadowing that's easy to miss because it operates at the level of aesthetic rather than plot. The design tradition of the giants was being constructed from Little Garden forward specifically so that when Loki appeared, he would feel like the inevitable product of that tradition. Not a newcomer, not an introduction. The culmination. The thing the tradition was always building toward. Pause beat. Let me also spend time on the specific connection between the Nidhoggr fruit and the Mythical Zoan category, because I think there's something important here about what Mythical Zoan fruits represent in the endgame of One Piece. Marco's Phoenix, the Hito Hito no Mi model Nika, Kaido's Seiryu. These are mythical Zoan fruits that carry the specific property of connecting their user to something genuinely legendary. Not just a powerful animal, a figure from mythology. And what that connection does is give the user access to the symbolic and cosmological weight of the mythological being they become. When Luffy activates Gear 5, he doesn't just get physical power. He gets Joy Boy's will, the drums of liberation, the reality-warping playfulness of the Sun God. The transformation is a connection to something that exists beyond the physical. The Hito Hito no Mi model Nika turns Luffy into the embodiment of liberation itself. The Ryu Ryu no Mi model Nidhoggr turns Loki into the embodiment of the dragon that destroys the foundation of the cosmos. Not just a dragon, the specific mythological entity whose existence is defined by that specific function. The Nidhoggr doesn't breathe fire at random. The Nidhoggr gnaws at roots. It dismantles foundations. It creates the conditions for collapse of old structures. And that's the combat function of the Nidhoggr in One Piece. Not random destruction. Targeted dismantling. The ability to take apart the structural foundations of whatever needs to fall. The world government's power structures. The physical architecture of their military apparatus. The political systems built on 8 centuries of Imu's control. The Nidhoggr is specifically suited to dismantling those things, the same way it's specifically suited to dismantling the roots of the world tree. Oda designed the Nidhoggr fruit to have this function. The mythological encoding isn't just atmospheric, it's functional. The Nidhoggr is what you reach for when you need to tear something down at the roots. And in the final arc, there are roots that need tearing. Pause beat. I want to close this section with something that I think is the most important statement of this entire analysis. The thing that the Loki foreshadowing, taken in total, is actually saying about the construction of One Piece. Oda has been writing the endgame of One Piece from the beginning, not vaguely, not thematically, specifically, with chapter numbers, with specific cultural details in specific places, with design choices made years before the designs were needed, with names chosen knowing exactly what mythological weight they would carry in the eventual payoff. The God of War in chapter 116 is not an Easter egg. It's not a lucky retroactive connection. It's Oda, in 1999, writing a fact about a character he was going to introduce in 2025. Writing it in the voice of world building, because that's the voice that would make it invisible as plot setup until the plot was ready to receive it. And here's what that tells us about every cultural detail, every mythology reference, every title and legend and ancient story in One Piece. Every single one of them is a potential fact about a future character or event. Every god that a culture worships in this series might be a specific person. Every legend might be a history. Every mythological figure might be someone we're going to meet. The method Oda uses to plant seeds is to disguise them as decoration, as flavor, as the organic, cultural texture that makes the world feel rich and lived in. And then years or decades later, the decoration turns out to have been load-bearing. The flavor turns out to have been the recipe. And if you take that understanding seriously, and you go back through the cultural details of One Piece with fresh eyes, you will find things. There are cultures and mythologies in this series that haven't fully paid off yet. There are titles and figures and legendary weapons that are still seeds, still waiting for the appointed chapter, still quietly pointing at someone who hasn't appeared yet, or at a role that hasn't been fully revealed yet. The Loki foreshadowing teaches us not just about Loki. It teaches us how to read One Piece. It teaches us that the decoration is always real, that the mythology is always history, that when Oda mentions the god of war in chapter 116, he's telling us something true about the world, even when we don't have the context to understand it yet. And 27 years later, we do. Pause beat. Now let me do the final assembly, the complete picture of what Oda built, from the first seed to the current payoff, and what it means for where the story goes. The God of War title from Little Garden, the Hammer tradition, the Western Dragon experiments at Punk Hazard, the impulsive prince of chapter 858, the accursed prince pattern that maps onto Robin and Ace, the Adam tree as Yggdrasil, Ratatoskr as the guardian who maintained the relationship between the dragon and the world above, the prophetic alliance with the sun god, the Norse mythology of Loki as trickster and father of monsters and catalyst for Ragnarok, the chains that mirror the bound mythological Loki waiting for the appointed time, the dark palette design that complements rather than opposes the solar imagery of Gear 5. All of it. One character. 27 years. And the resolution that the foreshadowing points toward. The truth of Orist Castle. The chains breaking. The Nidhoggr freed at the appointed time. The giant beast covering the skies alongside the sun god of liberation. The world government's preparations failing because the one thing they managed to contain for 6 years was always going to break free when it needed to. The god of war being recognized as the hero Elbaf's tradition always said he would be. The prophecy becoming the present tense. And after the war, if the mythological framework holds, the Nidhoggr surviving into the new world, carrying the memory of what was into what comes next. Loki was always going to be here. From the moment Dory and Brogy mentioned the God of War in 1999, Loki's story was in motion. We just hadn't caught up yet. Pause beat. This has been the complete Loki and Nidhoggr foreshadowing analysis. All 3 parts. And here's what I want you to take away from it. Not just the specific connections, not just the chapter numbers. The broader understanding that One Piece is a series where every detail is a seed and every seed has a payoff. Oda plants in the vocabulary of world building. He disguises facts as flavor. He hides character sheets in cultural descriptions. And if you take that understanding into your next read of any arc, into your next encounter with a cultural detail that seems like texture, into your next exposure to a mythology reference or a legendary title or a god that a culture worships, you will read One Piece differently. You will look at those details and ask the question this analysis has been asking. What specific future person is this describing? What specific future event is this preparing for? What is this seed going to become? Because in One Piece, it always becomes something. Oda always keeps his promises. The God of War mentioned from 1999 kept its promise in 2026. And somewhere in the chapters you've already read, there are promises you don't know about yet. There are seeds you haven't recognized as seeds. There are facts disguised as decoration. And someday, years from now, you're going to read the chapter that completes them. And you're going to have the same feeling that chapter 116 gives you now in hindsight. The feeling of, oh, that was always about this person. Oda told me. I just didn't know how to read it yet. Pause beat. I found, going through this research, that the Loki foreshadowing is not just wide in terms of the number of seeds. It's deep. It's operating simultaneously at the level of specific plot details, at the level of visual design, at the level of mythological encoding, at the level of character psychology, and at the level of institutional political behavior. Every layer of the foreshadowing is pointing at the same person from a different angle. Every thread leads to the same place. That kind of depth across 27 years of planting is the thing that makes One Piece genuinely unlike anything else in manga history. Not the scale of it, not the longevity of it, the deliberateness, the fact that the God of War in chapter 116 wasn't happy coincidence or retroactive connection. It was Oda in 1999 doing what he always does, writing a letter to the future, trusting that the future would arrive, and keeping his promise when it did. Drop in the comments what hit hardest. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for every chapter of the Elbaf arc as it develops. We are going to keep pulling these threads for as long as Oda is planting them. And based on 27 years of evidence, he's going to keep planting them until the very last page. I'll see you there.